Episode 4, East Asia in the Time of the Mongols. Question 1. What would be the lasting impact of the failed Mongol invasion of Japan? Having conquered the Song, Kublai Khan set his sights further to the east toward Korea and Japan. A successful occupation of the Korean peninsula afforded the Mongols an ideal launching point for an invasion of the Japanese islands. The Mongols dominated during initial skirmishes and quickly overwhelmed the Japanese defenses, slaughtering foot soldiers and samurai cavalry alike. The invaders rained poison and flaming arrows and gunpowder-filled ceramic projectiles down upon the defenders. The samurai warriors soon realized that their legendary steel swords struggled to penetrate the thick leather armor worn by Mongol fighters. In response, the most powerful of the Japanese leaders, Hojo Tokimune, rallied the disheartened clans into a more substantial and coordinated fighting force. Despite this unprecedented show of unity, the Mongols and the Japanese were headed toward what could only have been a devastating victory for the invaders when Mother Nature intervened. A typhoon struck the Mongol navy. Most of the troops had regrouped offshore in preparation for the final assault, and so the Mongols lost both their ships and their army. Naturally, Kublai Khan was undaunted and ordered a second invasion, this time with even more ships and troops. But the Japanese anticipated that another effort would be made and had built defensive positions, including a low wall on the northern shores of Kyushu. Despite again facing a numerically superior foe, the Japanese maintained the upper hand, inflicting heavy casualties on the Mongols. Incredibly, a second typhoon struck, again decimating the invading forces, ending the invasion. Such was the cost in both manpower and resources that the Mongols would never attempt another invasion of Japan. That the Mongols never succeeded in conquering Japan is itself historically significant, but of more consequence was the impression made on the Japanese political structures. Japan had for centuries been consumed by inter-clan warfare and had no centralized authority beyond the largely symbolic role of the quasi-divine emperor. The lesson of the successful defense of the islands was that unity and centralization of authority would be essential in securing Japan against foreign antagonists. What began was a gradual coalescing into a more or less centralized state under the authority of a string of shoguns. Question 2. Describe Kublai Khan's policies toward Mongol-Chinese integration. How does this fit with the overall impact and significance of the Mongol era? Despite his concern that the conquering Mongol minority would be absorbed and obliterated by the culture of the defeated, Kublai Khan had long been fascinated by Chinese civilization. Even before his advance on the Song Empire, Kublai had solicited the counsel of an array of Chinese advisors. His capital at Dadu, present-day Beijing, was built on the site of previous dynastic capitals, and he incorporated Chinese rituals and classical music into his court. He abandoned the admittedly ostentatious traditional tent complexes in favor of an imperial palace. These preferences reflect Kublai's determination to civilize his Mongol followers according to Chinese standards. This is the clearest illustration of the ultimate impact of the Mongols. The extent of their dominance was so vast that they permanently connected regions of the globe that had previously little knowledge of, let alone interaction with, each other. The Mongol disinterest in interfering with the socio-cultural context of each conquered people consequently meant that the connection and the cultures would each persist long after the Mongols were gone. Question 3. Why is Marco Polo important from a world history perspective? Kublai Khan welcomed travelers and emissaries from many distant lands to his court. Kublai had a strong interest in all religions and insisted on tolerance in his domains. Buddhists, Nestorian Christians, Taoists, and Latin Christians all made their way to his court. Perhaps most significantly, at least from a European history perspective, was the arrival of members of the Polo family. Traders from Venice, the Polos had traveled extensively in Africa and Asia for decades in the late 13th century, and the Mongol Empire in the middle of the 13th century. Marco Polo's recounting of his time as an administrator in the court of Kublai Khan is perhaps the most famous travel account written by a European. He accepted at face value fantastic tales of strange customs, and probably plagiarized parts of his work, Book of Marvels of the World. Nonetheless, his descriptions of the palaces, wealth, and cities of the empire of Kublai Khan enhanced European awareness of Asia and inspired later voyages of exploration that would seek passage to these lands. Such was the European appetite for exotic goods from the lands described by Marco Polo, that they ventured into literally uncharted waters, and in doing so began the process that would lead to global European domination for centuries. Question 4. Who in Chinese society benefited from the Mongols' pragmatic approach to governance? Who then lost out? And what were the long-term effects of this on Mongol rule of China and its aftermath? Despite the efforts of Kublai Khan to adapt Mongol culture to that of the Chinese, resistance to assimilation proved to be intractable. The opposite was also true. Ethnic Chinese subjects never fully accepted Mongol rule. Kublai Khan's cultivation of Confucian rituals and extensive employment of Chinese bureaucrats did little to temper Chinese resentment towards the occupiers. In fact, most of the scholar gentry saw the Khans as uncouth barbarians whose policies endangered Chinese traditions. Additionally, his refusal to reinstate the examination route to administrative office prevented the scholar gentry from dominating politics. Kublai Khan's attempt to moderate scholar gentry power went further, much to their contempt and resentment. He went to great lengths to bolster the position of the artisan class, who had long been dismissed by the scholar gentry, and the merchant class, who the scholar gentry viewed as parasites. From the outset, the Mongols had shown great regard for artisans and their practical usefulness. The Mongols likewise embraced the merchant class, whose commercial activity helped grow the wealth of the empire. This elevation of previously subordinate groups at the expense of the scholar gentry ultimately resulted in persistent scholar gentry pushback, which in turn contributed to efforts to expel the Mongols. Upon returning to power, the scholar gentry set about reasserting their authority, erasing any gains made by the merchant and artisan classes under the Mongols. Question 5. What was the Hongwu Emperor's approach to the scholar gentry? The Hongwu Emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty who led the successful expulsion of the Mongols in the late 14th century, was from a peasant family and was thus minimally educated. As such, he harbored a suspicion of the scholar gentry, but he also realized that their cooperation was essential to the full revival of Chinese civilization. As a result, scholars well versed in the Confucian classics were once again appointed to the very highest offices in the government. Most critically, the civil service examination system, which the Mongols had discontinued, was reinstated and greatly expanded. The Hongwu Emperor was mindful of his dependence on well-educated and loyal bureaucrats for the day-to-day administration of the empire, but he took care to place limits on their authority and influence. He insisted on institutional reforms that would check the abuses of power of other factions at court. Early in his reign, he abolished the position of chief minister, which had formerly been the key link between the many ministries of the central government and was thus a potential locus of corruption and disloyalty. He also tried to impress upon all officials the honesty, loyalty, and discipline he expected from them by introducing the practice of public beatings for officials found guilty of bribery, corruption, or other wrongdoing. The reforms of the Hongwu Emperor did much to reset the excesses of the bureaucratic aristocracy that had contributed to the fall of the Song dynasty, but most of his reforms did not survive his death. The scholar gentry had successfully reclaimed their privileged position in Chinese society, and for a time afterward exhibited a renewed sense of dedication, eventually succumbing, however, to the same excesses as had the Song dynasty. Question 6. Contrast the strengths of a scholar gentry class with that of a warrior aristocratic class. Why specifically did a warrior class, rather than a scholar gentry class, rise to power in Japan? Though the emperor was kept in his quasi-divine role by the various competing warlords, by the late 1200s, imperial influence did not extend much further than the walls of his ostentatious palace complex in the sacred city of Kyoto. It had been a coalition of the militant clans that repelled the Mongols, not the courtiers and attendants that comprised the imperial court. The samurai's successful defense of the islands left little doubt that they, and not the emperor and his Chinese-influenced court, were the true locus of political authority in Japan. Pretensions to a mandate of heaven and centralized power were now unrealizable, and grand plans for an imperial bureaucracy a la the Chinese never materialized. The emergence of a scholar gentry class was preempted by the reassertion of aristocratic rather than bureaucratic privilege. It was clear that whomever could bring the warring clans under one banner would do so in a distinctly Japanese rather than Chinese manner. Question 7. Describe the socioeconomic organization of a bushi household. Paralleling the development of feudal power structures in medieval Europe, the socioeconomic organization of Japan from the Middle Ages onward was based on land ownership. Elite families in outlying regions, some with aristocratic origins, but many with more humble beginnings, came to control land and revenue, which they retained at the expense of the court. Gradually, they established small kingdoms ruled by house governments across the Japanese archipelago. The heads of these clan-based houses, known as bushi, dominated their respective territories from small fortresses surrounded by wooden or earthen walls and moat-like ditches. The bushi and their retainers lived within the fortress, constantly on alert for attacks from neighboring lords or the forces of powerful court families. Granaries for storing rice provided by local peasants, wells for water, blacksmith forges, stables, and even armories made the fortresses, much like those of medieval Europe, self-contained worlds. Within these mini-states, warrior leaders administered law, supervised public works, and collected revenue. The socioeconomic hierarchy, whereby peasant agricultural labor provided the income necessary to support a warrior class, who in turn owed their loyalty to a bushi, is essentially identical to that of medieval European feudalism. Question 8. What was the bakufu, and how does this contrast with the traditional government? What is the difference between shogun and emperor? A series of wars in the late 12th century resulted in the domination of a sizable territory on the main island of Honshu by a single clan, the Minamoto. The Minamoto established the bakufu, which literally means tent government or military government. The name reflects the idea that a military leader in the field needed mobility and would therefore command from a tent. This marked the beginning of the era of the shoguns, who would dominate Japanese politics until the 19th century. Shogun was the title adopted by the heads of the Minamoto clan, and as the power of the bakufu grew to eclipse that of the imperial court, the shogun effectively became the ruler of Japan. The emperor retained his title and wealth, largely due to his semi-sacred symbolic status, which could serve the interests of a dominant shogun. The era of the shoguns played a key role in establishing Japan's uniquely militant national character. Question 9. Why did the Vietnamese become the dominant force in Southeast Asia, as opposed to the Cham or the Khmer? For roughly 1,000 years before establishing an independent state in 939 CE, Vietnam had been conquered and ruled by a succession of Chinese dynasties. Although the Vietnamese were ethnically quite distinct from the Han Chinese, they nonetheless established a state that, in many ways, resembled a smaller version of the imperial government of their former rulers to the north. The bureaucratic and administrative strength provided by the Chinese model gave the Vietnamese significant advantages in the struggles within Indochina that would follow in the centuries after independence. The Vietnamese wisely chose not to settle in the highlands to the south and west. Though they regularly traded with the inhabitants of these regions, they sought to minimize personal contact and cultural exchange with these groups, primarily hunters and subsistence farmers, whom they viewed as little more than noble savages. In their conflicts with the only other peoples in the lowlands, the Cham and the Khmer, the Vietnamese prevailed due to their larger population and the superior bureaucratic and military organization possible under the Chinese model.